So welcome to your first small short lecture video. Now before I start, I would like you to pay particular attention to the two links I posted. Foreign Policy Magazine, the top conflicts to watch out for in 2018, as well as the Eurasia Group's kind of geopolitical overview of what we might expect in 2018, and they're quite pessimistic. The Eurasia Group is quite interesting, particularly for you business majors there. It's basically a political risk consulting group, looking at politics and examining and assessing the impact it might have on businesses. So again, if you're a business, if you want to do your due diligence, you look at political risk and what is involved. So for this course, I really like that in particular because some of the language you will be very familiar with. So in this video, I really like to look at what is it all about. Looking at international relations, some of the very, very basic key terms. I'm not looking at theories yet, and really an overview of what's hot right now. Now, if you're looking at what's happening right now, what's hot in international relations, globalization, of course, is an ever present venture and manifestation in that. And you, of course, have come across different aspects of globalization in your career as well as in your personal life. What are the implications for international relations? And then also, what does it pose? What sort of normative issues are being brought up by globalization as we study international relations? Now, again, if you're looking at globalization, what it's all about, we're looking at an intensification of worldwide economic, political, and social integration, which means a crisis in one region may affect the rest of the world. The European refugee crisis is a prime example. The conflict in Syria led to mass exodus of Syrians, and that had huge ramifications as those refugees entered and sought refuge in the European Union. And it was dealt differently in different countries. Proliferation of multinational corporations, they have really become key players in the global economy. Multinational corporations are not necessarily something new. If you're looking at the very foundations and the key players of imperialism, British Empire, the British East India Company. This was basically a very early multinational corporation which underwrote both the economic lifelines of the empire, but also looking at it was part of the security infrastructure. So again, multinational corporations are not necessarily something brand new. They've been around for some time, but they certainly have grown in their magnitude and in the political power they have in international relations. We have new modes of communication infrastructure, and okay, that sounds fair enough. That's obvious, but just look at Twitter. Twitter didn't exist a bit over 10 years ago. In 2011, Twitter and other social media toppled entire regimes in North Africa and the Middle East. So again, this is something to keep in mind, that new types of communication devices, new types of media, new technology is being introduced, is being used by different players globally, and can have a massive impact on politics. So again, that's important to keep in mind. Migration, people on the move, either forced migration, looking for better opportunities, that has a ripple effect throughout international relations, and we'll look more closely at different aspects of migration in this course. The growth of transnational organizations, so again, looking at the European Union, looking at the United Nations, different more technical organizations like the World Health Organization. Countries, are cooperating on certain issues, pooling resources, and we'll be looking at the European Union. That is, a great success story when it comes to political and economic integration. But of course, Brexit in 2016 has shown us, and continues to show us, that these are not. These sort of unions are still subject to forces like nationalism. Conflict, security, terrorism, again, these are not new manifestations in international relations. They have been around in different forms, but certainly globalization further accelerates these. Now, again, if you try to conceptualize globalization within our field of international affairs, we're looking at stretching, intensification, and accelerating pace. So a stretching of social, economic, and political activities. So events in part of the world can affect distant regions. So that could be, decision being made in the White House, a decision being made at the United Nations in Geneva. could have an impact on other communities, other governments, economies. Intensification of growing magnitude of interconnectedness. So again, we really seeing that communities, societies, and of course economies are really interconnected and interdependent on one another. So again, no country really can go on its own, and we see that in particular the integration of international political economy. If you're looking at the burden of taking care of our global commons, we're looking at environmental politics. These sort of things which we discuss in the course, it highlights how intense that interconnectedness has really occurred in the last several decades. And then accelerating pace of global interactions and processes. So evolution of worldwide systems of transport, communication really increase the velocity, rapidity which with ideas, means, and goods, capital, and technology move around the world. So again, these are the three elements if you try to conceptualize what globalization means for international relations. So at the heart, globalization is a process of deterritorialization. Now that sounds really kind of sci-fi, a process of time and space compression. So, sources of local development can be traced to distant conditions or decisions. Now again, looking at, for example, the World Bank or IMF, very, very powerful organizations dealing with fiscal matters, with development. They are providing a lifeline to one poor country in Latin America or Asia or Africa, on the condition that that particular country has to meet certain areas of liberalization when it comes to the economy. Usually a reduced role of the government, free market, that is the mantra which usually the IMF and the World Bank deal with. And that has a huge impact on different public services, public health. A lot of people in that particular country might be in the public sector, might work for the government or the local state. So that decision which was made at the IMF, the idea was, well, we will give them money, but we'll give them development on the condition that they have to make these adjustments. They're called structural adjustment policies, and we'll be discuss this when we have our topic on international political economy. But that is what is meant, that a source of every local development may be traced to a distant condition or decision. So this is really power is being exercised at a distance. The decisions being made largely in the global north will have an impact on countries, on regions, on communities across the world. Now again, a definition. What is globalization? A historical process involving a fundamental shift or transformation in the spatial scale of human social organization that links distant communities and expands the reach of power relations across regions and continents. So that really is a mouthful. It really is, the bottom line is distinction between domestic arena and the external breaks down. Bill Clinton once said we can no really talk about domestic policy or foreign policy. We're looking at economic policy. We're looking at environmental policy. These are the things which affect us both domestically as much as in terms of foreign affairs. It's all coming together. It's all interconnected. We cannot really distinguish between foreign and domestic. Now, what are the patterns? We're looking at different patterns. So economic is largely many scholars would say, well, globalization really is just another manifestation on the stage of global capitalist expansion. So again, capitalism, it needs to expand, it needs to acquire new markets. That is the economic aspect of it. In military terms, we see proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Terrorism has been high on the agenda for policymakers throughout the world, in the West as much as in the Middle East, parts of Africa and Asia. So really challenges to the state by different non-state actors, whether these are militias, vigilantes, or terrorists, global arms trade, and largely global insecurity. We don't have the Cold War anymore, but certainly for the last several decades, we still are dealing with different aspects of instability. We're looking at the Korean Peninsula, we're looking at in India and Pakistan, two nuclear armed powers. Israel has nuclear weapons. Middle East is far from a stable region. So different aspects of insecurity still cause us headaches. Legal expansion of international law, another aspect of globalization. So many scholars would point to the fact that we really have become a lot more progressive in how we conduct state behavior, how we enter into agreements with other countries, and the body of international law has grown tremendously over the last several decades. Looking at the environment, shared ecology means shared problems, means that we have to solve these together collectively together as in an international community. And then cultural, we really have two type of responses to globalization. One is homogenization, that everything becomes, the sort of accepting of the same culture. We all watch the Kardashians, we all eat McDonald's. And then of course, the other one is the rejection of that. And that the rejection can have different, all the way to violent expressions of how people don't want this sort of process in its cultural manifestation. And quite often it's seen as globalization equals westernization, of course. And then social, looking at issue of migration, of how this manifests itself differently across the globe. Now again, what are the engines? We're looking at technology, economics, and politics. So again, technology managed earlier without communication, global systems today would not be possible. The technology we have today is a major driving force. Economics, again, what I mentioned earlier, that is really the driving force, that capitalism needs to expand and needs to have new market, and of course it's driven by profits. And politics really is the shorthand here of ideas, interest and power. It really provides the normative infrastructure. It guides it throughout. So it's sort of the handmaiden, if you like, the normative handmaiden of globalizations. So these three, technology, economic, politics, are three main engines of globalization. Now, the flip side of it is that globalization is still highly asymmetrical. Now, what does this mean? Asymmetrical, we will discuss this throughout the course, that really not everybody has and enjoys the fruits and benefits of globalization. Largely, in the global north, we really see most of the benefits of globalization. And many scholars, structuralist scholars, neo-Marxist scholars would argue that the global north continues to benefit at the expense of the global south. And we'll discuss some of these theories and how they play in the international relations later on in the course. Now, again, one important reference point for you is the Treaty of Westphalia. And it's a bit of history, but it's important for your understanding of international affairs and for ideas of politics in general. So the Treaty of Westphalia ended the 30-year war which had ravaged throughout Europe. And it really is the reference point for today's understanding of statehood. It was the agreement between the rulers that we will recognize each other's right to exist and rule over our own territories. This was the beginning of the idea of modern statehood, and that goes all the way back to that Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. It really established these three elements. Territoriality. Humankind is principally organized into exclusive political communities with fixed borders. Sovereignty. Within its borders, the state has an entitlement to supreme, unqualified, and exclusive political and legal authority. We in international relations and political science, we call this the monopoly of violence. Now, monopoly of violence sounds a little strange. Students don't like it. What this means that in that territory, the sovereign, the government, is the exclusive entity which can police and rule over its territory. That is sovereignty. Autonomy, this is sort of the Las Vegas rule. Whatever happens in that country stays in that country. We don't concern ourselves with what happens over there in that country, on this country. We are just dealing with ourselves here. So that's sort of the Las Vegas rule, I call it. No ruler has the right to intervene in the sovereign affairs of other states. So territory, sovereignty, autonomy. These are the three elements the Peace of Westphalia has established. Now again, you look at sovereignty. Once the monopoly of violence breaks down, what happens? We have civil war. That happened in the United States in the US Civil War when the Confederate states broke away from the Republic, and the federal government had to, use violence, use forces to establish the integrity of the United States again. So it happened in the United States. Any other civil war today deals with the monopoly of violence being eroded. That one group, one militia group, an outside force helping a militia group, threatening the monopoly of violence. So that is when sovereignty is being threatened. So again, if you're looking at globalization, so we have this idea, these three elements: territory, autonomy, and sovereignty. If you're looking at today, we can say that states sort of have lost that privileged status in international relations. We're looking at international organizations, transnational networks, of corporate non-governmental actors. We have issues. We have groups like Greenpeace, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. These are all non-state, international, non-governmental organizations which have an impact on what's happening, influence decision making. Make societies aware when something is going wrong. A watchdog on governments. So states really have lost this sort of privilege status. We're also looking at different forms of international law, global governance like the United Nations, European Union, different international regimes, looking at environmental regimes, security regimes, human rights regimes. So these are different agreements which states subject themselves to in order to fix certain problems and overcome certain issues. And again, we will discuss all of these throughout this course. And we also have an embryonic form of transnational civil society. Now again, a transnational civil society means that we do actually have an opinion about what's happening in other countries. I feel very strongly about how women are treated in other countries. I don't know these women, but surely, mainly by our shared humanity, I have a strong opinion about a mistreatment of minorities, of fellow humans. And you can see that of course, has progressed over the course of the 20th century. And these sort of a transnational civil society has become a lot stronger in sort of what impact they have on international relations and foreign policy making. Global issues: pollution, terrorism, human rights, migration, all of these transcend national boundaries. As I said earlier, that that distinction between the domestic and the foreign becomes a lot more difficult to maintain. And if you look at old diplomacy based on geopolitics, that seems poorly adapted to if we looking at that entire package of new wicked problems states are facing today. So again, overall, we see that power is being distributed amongst many actors in international relations. States are still very, very powerful entities. That is very important to highlight. But we have different forms of players, different forms of actors in international affairs, which can cause different hiccups and certainly influence states in how they make their decisions. So sort of we have perhaps a kind of a post-Westphalian order. So we're looking at state sovereignty, sovereign power, again, to rule with their own space is being transformed, certainly, but not necessarily being eroded completely. Looking at state autonomy, in a more interdependent world, states are forced to cooperate. Sometimes they're forced to intervene. We can no longer turn a blind eye when we see genocide from taking place. Again, this is really the Holocaust is the reference point. But sadly, the Holocaust was not the last genocide which occurred in the 20th century. So the capacity to self-governance is compromised. If you start to slaughter people en masse in your government, it will be very difficult for the international community to say, okay, whatever happens in your country is your business. We don't take care of it. And looking at territory, border territory remain important, but certainly a new geography of political organizations and political power is emerging. Again, looking at the European Union, we have, if you live in the EU, if you're EU national, minus Britain, of course, now, you can live, work, and move freely within 27 EU countries. So again, and then the United States, Donald Trump won an election based on partly based on building a wall on Mexico. So you see these extremes. how we're looking at this sort of order. Now, again, we look at different forms of global issues throughout this course. So again, we're looking at ISIS, how ISIS came about, both emerging out of the Iraq conflict, emerging out of the Syrian conflict, and engaged in indiscriminate killings against Iraqis, Syrians, other minorities, and how then it's emerged as kind of a regional caliphate. ISIS was very different from Al Qaeda. Al Qaeda wanted to cause terror and political violence, and in order at some point establish a sort of political entity, ISIS said, "No, to hell with it. Let's start our own caliphate." From the beginning, for the first time, it was that a terrorist group controlled territory. So we look at ISIS and what ISIS really represented the last several years as far as international relations was concerned. We're looking at Ukraine and Russia. So again, I mentioned earlier that geopolitics is poorly adapted to modern problems. We really see that with Russia and Ukraine. That was a very, very old-fashioned type of takeover. Russia invaded the Ukraine, took over the Crimea, but it was not done like Russia would have done it during the Cold War, with a column of Red Army marching in. It was done in a very more clandestine, kind of a more sneaky, covert form. It was still a violation of sovereignty, and the bottom line is it is the only and the only remaining war right now in Europe between the eastern part of Ukraine, including Crimea too, and pro-Russian militias and also Russian forces in the Ukraine. Looking at what happened in Liberia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone in 2014, over 10,000 people died because of Ebola outbreak. So again, we're looking at US aid and the CDC, Center for Disease Control, so federal agencies were part of the response, but largely the champion which heralded the entire counter operations to contain the threat was the World Health Organization. So again, looking at the extent of civil aviation, this outbreak could have easily spread across Africa, and then certainly made it into Europe, Middle East, Asia, and the United States. Would have been worldwide. So again, this is public health, something which would have not been high on the agenda 50 years ago, is very, very high now on most national security agendas because of issues like you see here. And then let me look at talk about the 1033 program and the militarization of police. So here at JMU, here in Harrisonburg in Virginia, where I am, our police department got an MRAP. You see that here. Ohio State University also received an MRAP. So MRAP is a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. It's an assault vehicle. Now again, according to DoD, if you take off the little turret and the gun on the top, it no longer is a defensive vehicle defined by the DoD. It certainly does very little for community relations if you see a police vehicle driving up and down your street looking like that. Central Florida University acquired 23 M16s, assault rifles, and a grenade launcher from the DoD. Now again, the 1033 program was a program where over military surplus was given to police departments and university police departments across the country. Now, why is that? Why did the US government give away all that stuff? And that is a direct result, again, of globalization. So again, the US was involved in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2003 and 2001, respectively. Over a decade of war, of two wars, resulted in a lot of procurement of military equipment, which was then given away as those wars sort of largely were over, or the US forces withdrew, and then that was given to police departments. So again, if you're looking at the events in Ferguson, Missouri, then pictures of a highly militarized police shooting at African American protesters, and certainly use of lethal force in that policing really shook the American public. And again, President Obama then responded to that and put that program on ice for some time. But that was, again, what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq had a huge impact on local communities in the US because of the procurement of military equipment, and that military equipment through that program was then given to different university police and city police departments. University of Vermont declined, as did the Berlin Police Department. You will be pleased to hear. So to conclude, we will look at globalization throughout this course in its different aspects. And as I mentioned, it could be seen as perpetuating global inequalities and injustice, or it can be seen really as a driving force for prosperity and peace. So different schools of thought on globalization. Some talk about a cosmopolitan democracy. We're looking at towards a more humane and just world. We're looking at regulating markets. That's happening certainly a lot more, preventing transnational harm to most vulnerable, extending democracy within states, the relation between states, looking at rule of law, political equality, social justice. These are all elements which have been championed by this concept of a cosmopolitan democracy. So we're looking at beyond borders. I mentioned before, we're looking at a sort of a transnational civil society. So this was the first short video where I wanted to introduce some very, very basic concepts of international relations.